Hi, and welcome to Lesson 2.7, Prove Angle Pair Relationships. So today's goal is obviously to be able to first identify the angle pairs and the different relationships, which we talked about last chapter with things like vertical angles, adjacent angles, supplementary angles, and complementary angles. So we're now going to build off of that into the idea of proof of these relationships. So we're going to start off with a few new theorems. Theorem 2.3 is known as the right angles congruence theorem. And simply put, Theorem 2.3 states that all right angles are congruent. Then we have Theorem 2.4, the congruent supplements theorem. And the congruent supplements theorem says if two angles are supplementary to the same angle or to congruent angles, then they are congruent. And remember, supplementary angles add up to be 180. If you want an image explanation of this theorem, you would look on page 125. Feel free to write that down or draw it out. But it simply states if two angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. And then in Theorem 2.5, the congruence complement theorem states if two angles are complementary to the same angle, and remember complementary angles add up to be 90. So if they are complementary to the same angle or to congruent angles, then they are also congruent. And again, an image of that one is also on page 125 if you want to draw it out or look at one to help you visualize this. So example one, we're going to first identify or try to identify pairs of congruent angles in the figures. Explain how you know they are congruent. So first, we're just going to start with figure A over here on the left. Now I see right away that my angle QVP is a right angle from the symbol there. QRS is a right angle from that right angle symbol there. And TVU is also a right angle. So what do I know are congruent? I know QRS is congruent to PVQ, and both of those are congruent to TVU because all three are right angles, so all three are congruent to each other due to the right angle congruence theorem. In B, they give us some information above. They tell us angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary. And then they tell us 2 and 3 are complementary. And then 2 and 4 are supplementary. So based on these four angles, can we conclude any pairs that are congruent? Well, angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent to each other by the congruent complements theorem, because angle 1 is a complementary to angle 2, and angle 3 is a complement to angle 2, so therefore 1 and 3 are congruent. Then we get into an additional postulate and theorem. Postulate 12 is the linear pair postulate. And simply put, if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. So if two angles make a linear pair, then they are supplementary. And remember, a linear pair would be two angles that create a straight line. Didn't mean to scroll. So linear pair, two angles that create a straight line. So in this case, if I had, pretend that's a straight line there, angle coming down, angle 1 here, 2 here. Angles 1 and 2 would be a linear pair if this line down here was a straight line. So they are also supplementary. Then we have theorem 2.6, and theorem 2.6 states vertical angle congruence theorem. And that means all vertical angles are congruent. And remember, vertical angles are if we have an x, they're on opposite sides. So 1 and 2 are vertical angles, or angle 3 and angle 4 are vertical angles. So vertical angles are on opposite sides of that x shape or intersection. So then, as we move down to example 2 is going to be making sense of this new postulate and theorem. So in example 2 says, use the diagram at the right, this diagram over here. So use the diagram at the right to answer parts A, B, C, and D. Now, what we want to remember is that vertical angles are always congruent from our vertical angle congruence theorem. And we also want to remember that linear pairs are supplementary or equal 180. So looking at part A, if the measure of angle 1 is 115 degrees, they want us to find the measures of angle 2, 3, and 4. So if I know 1 here is 115 degrees, I know angle 3 is vertical to that, so angle 3 is also 115 degrees. Then I know angles 1 and 2 are a linear pair, along with 1 and 4, so those have to add to be 180. So if I do 180 minus angle 1, which was 115, I am left with 65 degrees for angle 2, which is vertical to angle 4, so 4 is also 65 degrees. So we know in this image, 1 will always equal 3 or be congruent, and 2 will always be congruent to 4. So in part B, they tell us angle 2 is 64. So to figure out angle 1, because they're a linear pair, 180 minus angle 2 leaves us with 116 degrees. So angles 1 and 3 are 116, and angles 2 and 4 are 64 degrees. In part C, the measure of angle 3 is 106. So I also know right away the measure of angle 1 is 106 as well. Then to figure out 2 and 4, I need to do 180 minus 106, leaving me with 74 degrees for the measure of angle 2, which is also the measure of angle 4. And then our last one, part D. Part D, it says if the measure of angle 4 is 71 degrees, find 1, 2, and 3. So if 4 was 71, I know 2 is also 71. And then 180 minus the 71 gives me 1 and 3, which are each 109 degrees. All right, now moving into example 3. So example 3 says find the value of x and y. So this is where we're going to take those theorems and postulates about congruent angles and supplementary angles and apply that information. So we know that these two angles, the 6x minus 2 and the 7x, are a linear pair. So if they're a linear pair, they equal 180. So I take 6x minus 2 plus the other angle, 7x, and that equals 180. Then to solve for x, we would combine like terms on the left, 6x plus 7x. We're left with 13x minus 2 equals 180. Add the 2 to each side, divide each side by 13, and x would equal 14. In B, we were given a pair of vertical angles, so we know they are congruent or equal to each other. So I'm going to set these two equal to each other and solve for x. So 4x would equal 3x plus 13. Solve for x by subtracting 3x from each side, and x equals 13. And now in C, there's multiple different approaches to do this problem. What we want to keep in mind again is we're looking for our vertical angles or our linear pairs. So in this case, I know that the two up here add to 180, and I also know that these two, the 13x plus 9 and the 15x minus 1, are equal to each other or congruent. So I set it up as 13x plus 9 equals 15x minus 1. Solve for x, so we add 1 to each side, subtract the 13x, and we're left with 10 equals 2 times x, divide both sides by 2, and x equals 5. Now that I know x equals 5, what I did is I just put that back in to one of these two angles expressions. So 13 times 5 plus 9. 13 times 5 plus 9 gives me 74 degrees.